for attending today's Before Slavery webinar. My name is Pat Snipes, and I'm the founder of the Before Slavery Museum Project, where you can learn the pre-slavery history of African Americans. Today, we are delighted to introduce to some and present to others Professor Tudor Parfitt. He is our special guest. Dr. Parfitt is a British historian, writer, broadcaster, traveler, and adventurer. Think Indiana Jones. He's a professor at University of London School of Oriental and African Studies and Florida International University. Welcome, Professor Parfitt.
Very nice to you.
We have been experiencing technical difficulties, so we're going to jump right in here with Professor Parfitt explaining about the people that were selected for the slave trade.
Many of the slaves were brought, most of the slaves indeed, were brought from the interior to the coastal cities, and then they were sold by the African communities on the coast for not very much money to the slavers, who would then take them to the Caribbean and sell them again. So by the time they get to the Caribbean, these poor people, they've generally speaking traveled for a good long distance, maybe thousands of miles in Africa. Then they've had the transatlantic crossing, and eventually they've come to Africa. In the case of the Danish colonies, they weren't treated too badly compared with many other places. And this missionary then asked them questions about where they were from. How did they live? What did they eat? What were their social arrangements? What were their relationships with their neighbors? What was life like? In a very, very detailed way. So it's a remarkable and fascinating source. And among other things, one of the slaves, who was actually from this coastal kingdom, independent kingdom, which stayed independent until the 1890s when the French took it over, and which was very well organized, rather peculiar in some ways, but it was a very well organized state with, with a priesthood and obviously a king and aristocrats and nobles and quite wealthy, partly because of the recent slave trade, but also and particularly early on in its history, because they exported things like coconuts and copper and various other things, weaving material and some cotton and so on, various exports. So they really had quite a vibrant economy. And so this slave explained that in his country of Loango, precisely at the point where this ancient Bay of the Jews was supposed to be, there was a community of Jews, black Jews, and they had a number of peculiarities, one of which was that they did not speak on the Sabbath, that they had a special graveyard, which was not the same as everybody else's. It was specific to them, that they had stone, elaborately made tombs, and on these tombs there were images of snakes and lizards. Now, Jews in the regular way of things don't have tombstones with snakes and lizards on them, so this is a bit of a puzzle. What else do we know about them? We know that they were relatively wealthy. We know that they did not eat with what they call the Negroes in the country. I mean, they themselves were black, but they make a distinction between themselves and the Negro. So Later on, we don't really have very much information for a while about these people. This is, as I said, 1777 was when his book was actually published, but it reflects, I suppose, a reality of maybe 10 or 20 years before that. But in 1877, so 100 years down the line, there's a German uh, expedition to Loango. And this is full of scientists and anthropologists and sociologists and archaeologists. And they arrive there in a boat and they set up a camp. And as it happens, they set up a camp just next to where the village of the Jews is, so on the Bay of the Jews. And so we get a little bit more information about them from the German expedition. Certainly the fact that they existed is verified by the expedition. We have further confirmation that they're involved in trade, that they're quite wealthy, that they're rather resented by the rest of the population because they're richer. They're completely black. They're absolutely indistinguishable from the others, with the exception that there's a kind of, expression on their faces which reminds at least one of the German party of Jews. It was written in a rather anti-Semitic way. So, of course, my book is only partly about, what this community was like, what they were doing, how they lived, and so on. I could say a little bit more. I mean, you're interested in the position before slavery. Well, this was during slavery, but they were living in the same way as they had before slavery. And in fact, slavery didn't really tend to impact very much upon the coastal kingdoms. The coastal kingdoms were rich, as I said before, partially because of slavery, but they weren't about to send their own people into servitude, unless there's a good reason. If somebody does something terrible to the king or terrible to one of the priests or the nobles, then it could very well be that criminals would be sold into slavery and got rid of. But otherwise, they would get their slaves from the so they'd send slaving expeditions into the interior, and then they would bring back. They would attack villages. They would seize the people that they thought would get a good price. So it would be younger women, younger men, children. Not very small children usually, but older children, young teenagers particularly, and then they would manacle them and they would bring them across Africa, and then when they got to the coastal kingdoms, in this particular case, the kingdom of Loango, they would keep them in a particular pen. It's quite a well constructed special little township, in fact, where the slaves were, walled in. They weren't able to escape very easily. And then they'd wait for slave ships to come, and they'd haggle and get the best price they could. They were pretty good at haggling. They were good. They were good business people. They didn't give them away, but still the price differential between what the Loango merchants got for the slave and what the slavers got when they sold them in the United States or in the Caribbean or in Brazil or wherever it may be, there was a massive difference. From my research there, I mean, I was interested to see that in this particular state, about which very little is known, there's only one book devoted to it, and that was written some 30 or 40 years ago. It was a centralized state with a powerful king, some rather strange traditions. He was surrounded by a mass of traditions, which in a way elevated him above the common herd, if you like. One of the things which struck people, including Freud, the psychologist, towards the end of the 19th century, was that the king wasn't allowed to be seen eating, and if anybody did see him eating, that person would have to be put to death. So it was a way really of exaggerating the privacy of the king. Another curious feature of the kingdom was that there was the phenomenon of what were called white Negroes, and the existence of these white Negroes was of enormous interest at the time to the scientists of Europe, who formed part of the European Enlightenment, because nobody knew how was it possible for white people to be living in the middle of Africa when it was thought, in all probability, the skin color of the Africans was a result of things like heat or climate or sun or some such. It was only later that these things were rather discounted and put down to race as such, but that didn't really happen until the end of the 18th century. And so anyway, you've got these white Negroes, and the white Negroes were albinos, quite simply. But in the Western accounts, it was thought that there were entire tribes of white Negroes who were very, very powerful and had military importance as well as other kinds of social and economic importance. And in Loango, the king was surrounded by these white Negroes who acted as a sort of bodyguard and lived in very considerable wealth and splendor as part of the royal court. And they were there very largely because of their supposed magic powers. And if you read today in places like Tanzania, it's fascinating and also very horrific. There's always still a kind of idea that albinos in Africa are touched by magical powers. And in Tanzania, they are very, very greatly feared, and very often they're hunted down, they're killed, and their body parts are farmed, if you like, and are used in the preparation of magical potions. And I'm sure that happened as well, hundreds of years ago. There's no question about that. There was a particular issue about these albinos in many African states. So to conclude, it was a rather, I should say that the book I wrote, which is called Hybrid Hate, is not, there's a chapter or two about the Loango, and therefore about what's of interest to your group, which is to say the situation of Africa before slavery and during slavery. But what I was more interested in was the impact that this group of black Jews in Loango had upon the development of Western race theory, and the impact was massive, and it really fed into a slightly benign version of race theory, but it was certainly race theory. I should just say, because it's not obvious, and it might be of interest to you, that well, um, I don't really think that there was any racism before the invention of race. And we know the moment at which race was invented. It was right at the end of the 17th century when some bright spark from France with the idea of a thing as race. And thereafter, during the Enlightenment, the idea arose that the bodies of different sorts of human beings were different, and the abilities of different sorts of human beings were different. But these ideas didn't exist before round about 1680. And even at the beginning of transatlantic slavery, the reason for enslaving people was not because they were considered to be racially inferior. It was because they were considered to be a better bet, better value as slaves. I mean, they could have had other people. They could have got Muslims from North Africa, or they could have got Slavs from the Black Sea area, from Ukraine, and so on. There was a lot of slavery in the Mediterranean in the 17th century. Did pick upon West African slaves in the period. So now I think I can answer some questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'd like really to talk nature. Why do we think
it's an interesting question, but I mean, in the case of these, we don't have any information. It's possible, that one day we'll find some sources that will describe the customs, but for the moment, what is known about the Black Jews in Loango, essentially, I've told you. We don't really know much more about that. But of course, there are plenty of other Black Jewish communities in Africa. And I think one of the most populous, numerous communities is to be found in Nigeria, but there are others in Ghana, and also in Zimbabwe and South Africa, the Lemba particularly. If you take a kind of maximalist position, the numbers of Black Jews, which is to say Black people who declare themselves to be of Jewish origin, they may be Christians, and most of them are, but they nonetheless declare themselves to be of Israelite origin. In Africa, it's probably in the tens of millions, if not more. So it's a vast population. And what are their reasons for thinking that they are of Jewish origin? Well, in Nigeria, these convictions have led to the creation of a quite significant literature written by Nigerian historians, one of whom is quite well known. If you look him up on the internet, his name is Remi Ilona. And Remi was a student of mine at Florida International University. He's now gone to California, is doing his PhD there. And historians like him claim to be able to trace the arrival of Jews from very, very, very ancient times to West Africa, and they find traces of Old Testament worship largely in particularly Igbo societies, but also other societies throughout Africa. And apart from this kind of self-identification as Jews on the basis of the similarity of customs, things like circumcision, things like the celebration of first fruits, or things like the importance of the new moon for the demarcation of different ceremonies and holidays, or things like, the division of animals into those that can be eaten and those that it is forbidden to eat. A range of things like this persuaded not only Africans themselves, but also missionaries. So most of Africa during the 19th century, certainly, there was very little missionary activity, except in places like Angola and Mozambique, which goes way back to the 16th century, and was very, very successful, by the way, and very immediate. But when it comes to Central Africa, anything north of South Africa today, if you look at the border, anything north of that was not touched by missionaries until the second half of the 19th century. There was no penetration at all from the east coast of missionaries into Africa until Livingstone, and he was the first to go in from the Zanzibar side, and he had some impact, but it was obviously limited. And places like Kenya, it was not until the end of the 19th century, and so on. So most of Africa was not touched by missionaries until the second half of the 19th century. But as soon as missionaries did start going, and they were usually on the heels of colonists, and the colonists were largely, not always, but largely on the heels of military expeditions or trading expeditions, missionaries too very, very immediately had, the idea that many African, religious communities were actually of Jewish origin. And they did this partly because they weren't very well educated people, the missionaries. That's the first thing. The only book that they really knew very, very well was the Bible, and the only kind of ethnography that they knew was the Bible. And so they extrapolated from the Bible in terms of what they saw around them. And anything in, a local culture or a local religion that sort of reminded them of the Bible led them to believe that, yes, these people must in some way be Jews. Also, they were not capable intellectually, educationally, if you like. They were not really capable of discerning the nature of other unknown religions. It didn't really occur to them that what people were doing, the strange things that they were doing from their perspective, actually formed part of a religious tradition. And so they imposed, if you like, very often they imposed the idea that these people were of Jewish origin and their practices came from the Bible. And then they, of course, imposed Christianity because that's what they were there to do, was to preach the gospel. And then subsequently, the African communities themselves sort of internalized the teaching of the missionaries, and they mined their own traditions very assiduously in such a way as they were able to extract parallels between local religious phenomena and the Bible. Now, if you're looking at the academic world, generally speaking, the idea that Jewish ideas trickle down from, Egypt and Israel or Palestine or Ethiopia into Central Africa is considered to be quite racist, and it's called sort of diffusionism. And so most professional Africanists will object to it. And as far as African scholars are concerned, and particularly in Nigeria and elsewhere, they're not too bothered by this. They themselves see that there was a trickle down, and that Central Africa and Western Africa really were the recipients of kind of formal monotheism and many sort of Judaic traits a very long time ago. Another way of looking at it, which is also interesting, is that not in terribly ancient times, but certainly for around 500 years, there most certainly have, and we know this as a historical fact, most certainly have been black Jews living in Western Africa. And these black Jews in Western Africa, some of them we've discussed in Loango, but they were to be found in Nigeria and up in Senegal and the old Gold Coast, and in fact, just about everywhere really in West Africa. And these were the Jews who'd left Spain and Portugal when they were kicked out at the end of the 15th century and found refuge in Africa. So I'm saying that there were clearly black Jewish communities that were established all the way down the west coast of Africa, including places obviously from which slaves were taken. There's one very interesting group, just by way of illustration, which is to be found in Senegal, in the eastern part of Senegal, and they are ostensibly Muslims, but they call themselves Bani Israel, so the sons of Israel. Almost certainly these people are descended probably from the black Jewish communities that we know existed in coastal Senegal. There's one particular part of the coast which is called in French La Petite Côte, which is quite a lengthy piece of coast where there are a number of black Jewish villages in the 16th century. And probably this community of Bani Israel in the east are the descendants of these Jews who moved inland, and then probably south as well, because if you look at a whole range of documentation, going south from Timbuktu, where there was a black Jewish community which is very famous, and there were also black Jewish communities. Just a moment. There were black Jewish communities also in the area of Mali and in the Sahara Desert in different places, and these are well attested. So it seems to me that the idea of Judaism arriving in different parts of Africa, with any of these communities who could have been traders, or they could have formed part of slaving expeditions or trading expeditions, all sorts of things, is not at all inconceivable. And I think it's entirely wrong of sort of modern Africanists to take this view. It's based, really, to be honest, on ignorance of the history of the Black Jewish communities, which luckily now is being rescued, and partly through genetics. And one of the great things, I was quite involved with a Harvard group some years ago, and the idea of it was to really give history back to the African American community through the use of genetics, simply because so much African history was erased, and African Americans, don't really have any means of knowing where their forebears, where their great grandparents were from, and so on. And genetics, to some extent, can fill that gap in a very, very useful way. And I think that's one of the reasons that my own work in genetics was so well, received, generally speaking, because it had the effect of giving back history to people whose history had been lost through colonialism and modernity and slavery, of course, principally.
Wow, yes. Thank you so much. That was very enlightening information. I only have maybe one other question.
So, just about everywhere in Africa, Judaism is becoming a religion of some importance. In some cases, it's based upon historical evidence, as the practitioners think it to be. In some cases, it's based upon an aspiration to practice Judaism, as is the case in Uganda. But mainly, it emerges from the idea that historically, the many African communities actually are Israelites. Now, that is very, 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 very strong. And in South Africa, for instance, there are big communities of tens of millions of people, and the same is true elsewhere. They're Christians, but they firmly believe that they are of Israelite extraction at some remote time in history.
Okay, and one of our viewers, thank you so much, Dr. Parfitt. One of our viewers put in a question in the chat, and he talks about Paul Crook on the slave ship logs, and that there's some mention of pre-transatlantic slave trade, indications of Jewish belief, and
well, that's right. I'm not sure that there's any actual evidence. I was in touch with a Baptist chapel, I think in Charleston, which is very old. It goes back to the, I think to the time of slavery, just about. And there's some interesting writing on the end of the pews, which he sent me, and a number of scholars have looked at it. And it does look to me as if it might be Arabic. And we do have one or two examples of slaves in the United States, having a knowledge of Muslim prayers and some Arabic. It didn't really last more than one generation. Of course, they were isolated. It was part of the system that they would be separated from their family and from other people, from their original neighborhoods, villages, towns, and so on. So they were in isolation, and so their religious practices were lost, and all slaves ultimately became Christian one way or another. As far as Judaism is concerned, I've never come across any actual trace, a certain trace, that black Jews celebrating Judaism in Africa were enslaved and brought to America and carried on practicing it. One or two hints that it might be the case, but no more than that. Christians, you would expect it to be so, because, as I mentioned, particularly in Angola, which was a big, slave trading area, it had been Christianized for a few hundred years, before the beginning of slavery. So there were an awful lot of black Christians in West Africa. People forget this, but it's quite true that from just about South Africa up to the Congo, which is a vast coastline, most of that was Christianized, and it was not superficial. It wasn't just the the grandees and the upper classes. It was well organized, and there were mass conversions to Christianity, to the point that it was very difficult for Jews to be living in those areas because of the Inquisition and so on. So the only traces I know are Islamic, Muslim, absolute. Christians, there must be. I just don't know about it because I haven't researched it. Jewish, I haven't come across. Maybe there are, but I don't.
All right. So we know that Timbuktu became a huge Islamic location for higher learning, well known across the world. But prior to the ruler there deciding to banish Judaism pretty much, or what evidence do we have about the Jewish presence in Timbuktu?
There's plenty of evidence, plenty of books written about the Jewish presence in that part of Africa and going way down the coast. And I've detailed various books, but Timbuktu was a great repository of Hebrew learning, Jewish learning, as well as Islamic learning. The great Arabic teaching universities of Timbuktu had parallels in the Jewish community as well. And then in what is now Mali, going north and then going east and then going south, a couple of 100 miles south of that, there were plenty of traces of Jewish activity going back 1,000 years at least. So there's no question about that. It's all there, and all of that's been researched. What's been less researched is the impact of these literate and scholarly communities on developments in sub-Saharan Africa. And again, that's now being studied by quite a number of people throughout the world.
All right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we are so happy to have shared this time with Dr. Parfitt. It is definitely a treat. But